In the following session, I'm pleased to welcome Federica Mogherini, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, who will speak to us on EU defense and security policies. Vice President Mogherini's speech will be followed by a one-on-one discussion with Klaus-Dieter Frankenberger, the foreign editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung.
Grazie. Grazie e buongiorno a tutti, Presidente.
Good morning. Thank you. I would like to start by thanking.
But first of all, for the opportunity we have every year to look together at the state of our Union and at the ways we have to improve the state of our Union. I will get to the state of the European Union in a minute. But let me first spend a few words on the state of the world today, also because the two are somehow clearly interconnected. The state of the world today is a state of chaos, a confused proliferation of crises where conflictuality and confrontation seem to prevail on rationality. And that patient, difficult, sometimes frustrating but vital work of building a common ground among players that have different views and different interests seem to be an exercise of naivete in these confused, chaotic times. And yet, it is exactly when things don't go well that rationality, calm, predictability, respect, dialogue are the most needed. To avoid the worst-case scenarios, to prevent conflicts to spiral out of control, to contain tensions, to preserve what is still working and delivering, as we are determined to do with the Iran nuclear deal. I know this is not the mood of our times. It seems that today, screaming and shouting, insulting and bullying, systematically destroying and dismantling everything is already in place, is the mood of our times. While the secret of change, and we need change, is actually to put all our energies not on destroying the old, but rather on building the new. I have the impression that this impulse to destroy is not leading us anywhere good. It is not solving even one of the problems we need to face, and they are many. On the contrary, it is adding conflictuality to conflictuality. What really leads to solutions is the patient, respectful, rational, humble art of compromise, of building win-win solutions, where everybody's interests can find their own place, where you know that if something is good for your counterpart, it must not necessarily be bad for you. This is, by the way, the history of our union, when we found out that if our neighbor is better off, it's also good for us. On the opposite, we need to move from the I win, you lose approach to the common search for common solutions, because we do have common problems to face. And we are, each of us, as strong as the weakest of our neighbors and partners is. I'm not sure this is the proper way of saying this in English, but I guess in Italian sounds perfectly well. The chain is as strong as the weakest of its rings is. And in this global world, there is clearly no doubt that we are one interconnected global chain. So this change of attitude from confrontation to cooperation requires a strong, confident European Union. No other global player can work for this change of mentality. And the European Union is today the point of reference for all those that are investing in peace, multilateralism, free and fair trade, sustainable development, fight against climate change, human rights and democracy, social economy in a rules-based global order. This gives us a huge opportunity, probably much bigger than in all recent decades as Europeans. But it also gives us a huge responsibility. So the question is, are we able as Europeans to fulfill these expectations that both our citizens and our partners have on us? What is the state of our European Union? I'll be very clear and very frank. I believe the state of our Union is as strong as Europeans want it to be. Europeans means all of us. Governments of member states, national parliaments, local authorities, business sector, trade unions, universities, media, all the European citizens together. Because the European Union is not a building in Brussels. It's the union of all of us. And it is as good as we want to make it. I would say the state of the Union is as good as the state of Europeans is. So the question is, do we want to invest in our union? Then it works and it delivers. We don't want to invest in it, it turns into a dysfunctional labyrinth of faraway institutions. And when that happens, when we let the state of our union be weak, it's the most absurd waste we make of the most powerful tool we have in our hands, our union. Its state of health depends on all of us. Please go back with your memories to a couple of years ago. We were all discussing the end of the European Union. Many were saying that after the UK, others would have left the European Union. Our union was, 2 years ago, exactly this time, in a state of deep crisis. Then last year, during the celebration for the 60th anniversary of our treaties in Rome, 27 heads of state and government recommitted in quite a solemn and at the same time true, profoundly true way, recommitted to the relaunch of our union. Because they knew, I believe, that the only way to effectively serve their own respective national interests in today's world was and is through our union. They knew that it is not giving up sovereignty, but the only way to regain sovereignty in today's world. Because no country is big or strong enough to face the world of today alone. We can do it only together if we want to do it effectively. And in this last year, the state of our union has grown stronger, much stronger. Starting from the economy, and I know that Mario Draghi will say more about it in a while, to our capacity to act together to manage with our external action the migratory flows. I give you just one example. In partnership with countries of origin and transit, and together with UN agencies, we have assisted more migrants to return voluntarily to their countries in the course of 2017 than in all previous years together. But let me mention one other aspect where the state of our union has grown much stronger in the last year: security and defense. Security and defense are probably the best example of the state of our union today, or at least if you want to see the glass half full. The idea of a European defense community dates back to the 50s, as I know all of you in this room know well. But for over 60 years, it was impossible to achieve. Failure after failure, frustration after frustration, and veto after veto. I remember very well, in 2014, I was doing my confirmation hearing at the European Parliament, and I said at that time that I believed it was high time to fulfill the potential of our treaties on defense. But there, most people told me that it was completely impossible, the conditions were not there, and the political will was not there. But political will depends on us, and us only. It is not an external factor. It comes from us. So, in fact, we made it. We took the most significant step ever to build the European defense. after 60 years of failures. We started with a single command center for our military training missions in Brussels that has been now operational for more than 1 year. Then, with the Commission, we launched the European Defence Fund that will allow us by 2020 to invest €1.5 billion every year on defence research and on our defence industry to help member states spend better, spending together. And for the first time ever, I know that President Juncker mentioned this here this morning, for the first time ever in the European history, with the Commission we have proposed to dedicate part of the next EU budget in the multi-annual financial framework to the European defence, to support European defence industry and research. But that's not only this that we've done. We have, with the Council, launched the Permanent Structured Cooperation on Defence, using for the first time ever the provision of the treaty that allows us to go with different levels of engagement among member states, testing somehow two speeds in the field of security and defence among member states. And it worked. 25 European countries have committed to join forces on common projects, to provide troops and assets for our common missions, but also to speed up their national decision-making and to share information among them. We have now 17 projects we are now implementing that are very concrete, from a new system for maritime surveillance to a European training center for our troops who intervene in case of a natural disaster in Europe, in our neighborhood, or abroad. The range of security issues we face today is incredibly broad, and only together can we develop all the capabilities we need to protect our citizens and also to build peace. As we build in these 2 years these first elements of the European defence, we have also strengthened as never before our partnerships with NATO and with the United Nations, because we see our strength as fully complementary to the strength of others. The instruments we've set up in the field of security and defence have an immense potential, but obviously it is now up to us all to make full use of this potential. And again, it is a matter of political will, particularly from member states. As the work is a collective one, I would say a teamwork, it has been working exactly for this reason, and is going on. We're now focusing in particular on developing our civilian capabilities, and I have proposed to set up a new European financial instrument, the European Peace Facility, that would give us predictability to finance our civilian and military missions, but also to support our international partners in a much more efficient manner than the one we're having today. All these initiatives I mentioned, taken together, make the European Union of Security and Defence real. It's a beginning, but it's a very good beginning, something that just 2 years ago was considered by everybody impossible to achieve, even in part. Why did we manage? We managed because there was political will, there was a sense of purpose shared, there was teamwork, and there was a sense of responsibility. Everybody, every institution, every member state and European institution made its own part. And so after decades, finally, today we can innovate together, we can buy together, we can plan and act together in the field of defense as Europeans. Because today, the European way has become the only effective way to peace and security. In a world where military means are sometimes needed, but never sufficient alone, where security is never just a matter of traditional defense. The European way to peace and security is something we have learned in our daily work around the world. In Africa, where security needs the economy to flourish, and the economy works only if it is not threatened by criminal groups, terrorism, or instability. The European way to peace and security is something we have learned in Afghanistan, in the Sahel, or in Iraq, where we've learned that if you want to build a strong, resilient, democratic, inclusive state, You need a professional army, but the professional army is just as important as professional judges, doctors, and police. And the European way to peace and security is something we have learned, as I said, in our daily work around the world, when we've seen that security only comes with reconciliation. And in Europe, we have a certain experience about reconciliation and overcoming old conflicts and wounds. And the reconciliation process requires diplomacy, local development, and sometimes also a strong peacekeeping force. So soft and hard power together, smartly and carefully mixed, with local ownership as the compass for any decision. So there is a lot we can be proud of, but I'm not living on the moon. And the state of our union is clearly not only about security and defense. President Mattarella said it perfectly well yesterday. Allow me one sentence in Italian. La solidarietà sul piano della sicurezza, l'integrazione.
Solidarity on the level of safety and security and the military aspect cannot be separated from the civil activity.
Work on defense must be coupled with more common work on other issues, from migration to job creation. Not just out of solidarity, which is good in itself, but out of self-interest. Because the best way of serving our own interest is investing in our union. With defense, with the work we've done on defense, we have shown that with strong political will, with determination, with a certain stubbornness and visionary approach, and most of all, with hard, patient, collective work, it is possible to make full and good use of our European Union. It is the demonstration that we can aim high, dream big, and deliver beyond expectations. The state of our union has become stronger in these last 2 years, and yet it is challenged, probably today more than any time ever. I believe it is important, every single European citizen, that we realize what we risk to lose, and on the other side, what we can achieve, and the distance between what we risk and what we can. There's a very beautiful song that says, you only miss the sun when it starts to snow. I'm afraid we are getting to that point. And I believe the decision is only ours, a collective responsibility that calls on each and every of us, citizens of Europe, to invest in the most powerful tool we have to exercise our sovereignty, our union. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam High Representative, for this lucid and comprehensive, if not fully optimistic, overview. Let me say at the beginning, I feel very privileged to be here with you on this stage in the wonderful Palazzo Vecchio, and I feel also privileged to represent an organization that proudly supports the State of the Union event here in Florence. I cannot, but we have to speak a little bit about Iran. You were a key negotiator in the process that eventually led to the Accord of 2015. Now it seems to be in danger, if not in terminal danger. Is there a way out, or are we heading directly into the abyss?
I believe that we have a responsibility and a duty, I would say, to do all we can, and we can a lot, to preserve the nuclear deal with Iran. I've been saying for 1 year now, probably more, especially to our friends in the US administration, that this deal is not a bilateral treaty. It's a UN Security Council resolution, and it belongs to the entire world. The consequence of that is that no single country alone can destroy the deal or can undo the deal, because all the others stay in. And this is what we are seeing in these days. The reaction and the response of the international community almost unanimously backing the full continuation of the full implementation of the deal. So we as Europeans are determined to keep this agreement in place, to keep all our commitments under this agreement, and to help other parties to continue to be true to their own commitments for the sake of security in our region. This is what strikes me the most. Those that like this agreement and those that have never liked this agreement, I believe, agree on one fact, that was the agreement not in place tomorrow morning anymore, the dangers for the region, and Europe is part of the region, from a security perspective would be enormous and disastrous. The only thing the world and the Middle East would not need in this moment is a nuclear arms race. And for once that we have an agreement that is effective and it's working on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, we have to keep it. We have to do all we can to keep Iran committed to its nuclear commitments. The IAEA strictly verifying these commitments. There is no other single country in the world where the IAEA has a regime of verification stronger than the one in Iran. And also need to preserve the credibility and the autonomy of the agency, because the IAEA will be needed, as it has been needed in the past, for strong verification regimes everywhere in the world related to nuclear weapons. So, in particular, if you think of the possible scenario of negotiations with Pyongyang, dismantling the only piece of non-proliferation agreement that is working and delivering in the world would be, I believe, a big mistake. But again, my sense is this, and my commitment is this, on the name of the European Union and also personally, to keep this agreement in place.
So no matter that the United States has effectively pulled out of it, increased the tension, probably confrontation, you think this agreement will hold?
Yes.
We shouldn't speculate about Iranian behavior, but it will hold.
I'm not saying it's easy. It's going to be very difficult, and it's going to be very different from the past. But our determination is to keep this agreement in place. Obviously, we need the only country that can unilaterally destroy this agreement to stay committed, which is Iran. Yeah. But the words of President Rouhani are giving me reassurances on their intentions on the nuclear agreement. Obviously, we have many other disagreements with Iran, and the list is long, but they are other things compared to the nuclear agreement. And we discuss our regional disagreements or ballistic missiles issues or conflict in Yemen or conflict in Syria in other areas, in other formats. We can build on the effective full implementation of the nuclear deal to change the dynamic also on the fields where difficulties are still important. But yes, we are determined to keep the agreement in place. Europeans are determined and united in this. And I think I can announce today that I have convened for next Tuesday in Brussels a ministerial meeting with the foreign ministers of Germany, France, the United Kingdom. First, the three of them with me, and then we will meet with Foreign Minister Zarif on Tuesday in Brussels.
You probably know that this treaty better than anybody else. And you know probably that this treaty is not perfect, as the critics have always said it isn't. Is there any chance to enhance it by a separate deal, let's say on missiles, or is it now out of the order?
You know, the basic, I wouldn't say rule, because it seems that all rules are to be interpreted in a creative manner. That's very Italian. But the basic principle of diplomacy is that you can work on deals, you can work on agreements if you have spaces for win-win. What do the different parties gain out of an agreement? And I believe the Iran deal at the end of the day worked because we found a common ground. Iran was gaining with the lifting of the sanctions related to nuclear, because other sanctions are still in place, including European ones. And the international community was gaining in security because Iran was committing itself to a strict verification regime from the IAEA, never to acquire a nuclear weapon. So it was a win-win. I believe that any next step could be achieved, but only building on the basis of what we have already. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to imagine how you can enter into a new negotiating phase with the starting point of dismantling what you have achieved after 12 years of difficult negotiations. Because the other side would say, why should I engage in new negotiations if I cannot trust fully the fact that at the end of maybe another 12 years, and by the way, what happens in those 12 years of further negotiations if we don't have anything in place, if the outcome of that is then to be put in question by the next administration or another government taking place. So I believe that whatever we need to address with Iran on regional issues needs to be based on the full implementation of what we have already. Otherwise, the credibility of any possible project would simply be zero.
We celebrate the European-American relationship and say, well, we share the same values and we are long-standing friends and we cannot get along without each other. The reality is we disagree on a lot of things, policies, but also more and more on principles. How stable and strong is this partnership, or aren't we diverging on many issues, such as the Iran issue, which is a fundamental one?
You know, I believe that many Americans disagree with America these days. And that's the strength of a democracy. It's difficult to picture one country, one of the largest democracies on earth, like the United States, as one. There's an administration, there's a Congress that has in itself many different contradictions. There are the different states that are taking different positions. If you see California on climate change, that speaks for itself. And then there's the American citizens that are, I believe, very probably divided and asking themselves questions about the role of America these days in the world. I think it is important that we consider our relations with the United States not only as institutions to institutions, but people to people, as it has always been the case. Here we are in my own home country. For an Italian, it's impossible to imagine, as for a German, that Americans are not our closest friends and partners, because history ties us together. History is not enough. Economy ties us together, because the amount of jobs that are created in the US and in Europe because of our economic ties is immense. And I could continue. So I believe that history, values still, yes, and also interests and perspectives for the future still make of us the closest partners and friends, even if we do not agree with some of the choices of the current administration, and we're very frank and adamant about that.
Well, the economy is also a very good example of a field where we seem to have diverging perspectives and interest. When we met 4 years ago, or since we met 4 years ago, exactly around the corner, Madam High Representative, the world has not become a quieter place. To the contrary, last night our President Mattarella spoke of the winds of war that are blowing around us here. You know, we don't have to list all the problems and challenges we face. The list is forbiddingly long, frighteningly long. What is, in your view, the most pressing geopolitical issue for the EU?
Africa. Africa. I know this is surprising because it's not one conflict, it's a continent, and it's a continent with a growing population. But you know, it's our closest neighbor. I realized how close we are the day when I was flying from Tunis to, at that time, the EU presidency, Malta, and you fly south. From Africa to Europe capital at that day, you were flying south. We are so close, and the demographic and the security challenges, the economic challenges Africa is facing, I believe, are our own challenges. And then there's I would say, if I can mention two other issues, is definitely Syria, where we're seeing indeed a lack of global leadership, where we're trying together with the United Nations to fill the gap. both from the humanitarian and diplomatic point of view, but it's extremely difficult, and I'm not optimistic about that. And the situation around the Gulf. I believe that, again, we have to keep Iran committed to the nuclear commitments he has taken, also to prevent further tensions around and across the Gulf.
When you speak about Africa this morning, President Tajani spoke about a European Marshall Plan. The Chancellor speaks about a European Marshall Plan. How can we convince a skeptical public that this is one of our top priorities to address, and that we have really to invest resources in achieving what we want to achieve, basically stop migration, or at least controlling migration from Africa?
I believe, well, first of all, we already have a Marshall Plan for Africa in place since quite some years. We have a limit. One of the limits in the European Union institutions is that we fragment the amount of money we invest for different things under different chapters. But if you put all the money we invest in Africa every year together, from humanitarian to development to economic investments to digital to security, everything, you reach an amount of money that goes far beyond any Marshall Plan that you could imagine. So the Marshall Plan is already there. I believe Europeans should be more aware of the huge investments we are making in Africa, as the Africans are, because the Africans recognize in the Europeans their first partner and friend, by far. Sometimes we have some countries in particular, some colonial, let's say, post-colonial problems. But if you look at the reality today, Europeans and Africans are working hand in hand in all different fields. I believe the European public opinion understands this now perfectly well. Because if you want to manage migration, and if you want to prevent further security threats, in particular terrorism, there is one single place where you have to invest all your political, diplomatic, and economic efforts. That is the belt of the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. There is the place where most of the challenges could be either solved or could deteriorate in something dangerous for us. And I believe, Europeans now understand it's not charity, it's self-interest. And this gives us a good basis for, as we propose to do, having more resources for the European Union external action, because there is not one single member state that can be effective in Africa, for instance, or everywhere else, alone, rather than doing it together. If you put together EU and member states' investments on security, on economy, on migration, in any African country, that goes well beyond a Marshall Plan.
Yeah. You mentioned Syria. You spoke about the lack of global leadership. Actually, you also see a lack of European, or an example of European self-marginalization. Bombs fall in Aleppo, trains arrive in Munich and other places, turning, for example, the politics of my country upside down. What is your lesson? What went wrong, and what do we have to do in the future to address a crisis that has dramatic impact on our publics, on the coherence of the EU? Solidarity is the key word of today's program, and the rest. It's a civil war, it's a tragedy, it's turmoil, it's longer than the Second World War, and we still haven't found a clue to really bring our power that we have to bear.
The power we have on Syria, we are exercising it at full, and that is mainly humanitarian. If you look at the numbers, those that are doing by far most of the humanitarian assistance inside Syria and outside of Syria is the European Union. And I am personally very annoyed when I see that this is considered as something irrelevant, because this is saving lives and people. And to me, maybe I'm naive, but to me this is the meaning of all the work we're doing, life of people. Second, we are putting all we can in helping the United Nations solve the problem. And we have said from the beginning, this is a conflict that has to be solved diplomatically under the UN umbrella, because only the UN can gather the legitimacy and the unity of international and regional actors. Then the problem moves to the Security Council, which is blocked by a veto. And the problem moves to the fact that 2 years ago we were close to finding a solution. Why? Because we were finally putting together in a cooperative approach the different players in the region and in the world, from Russia to Iran to Turkey to Saudi Arabia to Egypt, you name it, to the United States, to Europe, that could help and support the Syrian parties to get out of the conflict. Then that model broke down. There is a certain, let's say, withdrawal of some of our partners and friends in the world that seem not to be less interested in that part of the world. And it's true, we can do a lot, but we cannot solve the crisis alone. We're doing our part. The problem I see is that not all are doing their part. And the leverage we have is partial. It is a strong leverage with some, but not on many others. And so we would need there a concerted effort from the international community. And again, you can put your own political will, you cannot force others to put their political will.
The forces that exercise power here have already indicated that we bring this session to a close. We all wish you well in navigating us well through the most turbulent times, and we all thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
In our next session, Mario Draghi, President of the European Central Bank, will address the audience. I now give the floor to Ramon Marimon, Professor of Economics and Pierre Warner Chair at the EY.
It's an honor for me to introduce the President of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi. From Rome, he got his undergraduate degree at the Sapienza in economics in 1970. And in 1977, his PhD at MIT with Nobel Prize winners Modigliani and Solow as his advisors. He then followed up in academic career in Italy from 1981 to 1991 as professor of economics and monetary policy in the University of Florence. We stayed in the World Bank as executive director, and then in 1991 to 2001 as Director General of the Italian Treasury. An direct experience in the financial markets in 2012-2005 in Goldman Sachs. And 2006 to 2011 as when he is the governor of the Bank of Italy. In 2011 is when he enters as president of the European Central Bank. An impressive CV, combining a very strong academic background, research as a professor, but also of civil service, of public service, both as a central banker, but as treasury director, knowing both sides of fiscal and monetary policy. An international one, and in particular, an European one. Still, that would have been possibly a story of a central banker of the European Central Bank. But here, years down the road, people will write the history of monetary history of Europe or central banks, and we'll have books, as we had from the last century, like the Milton Friedman and Schwartz classical book of the monetary history of the United States, or more popular, recounts of the laws of finance. And they will talk of, they will talk of both of them. Ben Bernanke and Mario Draghi have been by far the most important ones. Not only because they had to face the crisis, the financial and the euro crisis, but also because they had done an authentic revolution on what central banking is all about. They found themselves not only a serious financial and debt crisis, but the classical instruments like interest rate policies and so on, the so-called conventional policies, could not do the job. It is when we start holding conventional policies, and behind this, it was this fact. We had two major central bankers, or the two main important ones, with a very strong academic and research background to understand how you have to have the courage to act in a different way. Mistakes that were done in the crisis of the 20th century in the 30s were not done that time. But in particular, that was particularly more critical in the case of the ECB, because the first time that was facing a challenge. It was the major stress test for a new, relatively new central bank. Everyone knows and has been cited over and over his intervention in July 26, 2012. Whatever it takes. And yes, it has been a lot of research, and more research will be done about the impact it had in changing the path of the financial markets. This sentence has been here over and over as the one determining the change. And he will be famous by this. But no one gets famous in a real way to just say a sentence. You need more than that. You need to have policies, as at that moment they had developed both in the Federal Reserve Bank or the Bank of England, but then now in the ECB, the outright monetary transactions, OMT. But policies are not enough. Even if they are good policies, you need credibility. You need that when one stands and says something like this, is credible. And you don't gain credibility out of the blue. You gain credibility because you have a strong institution behind. You have a professional record of being a proper independent central banker. And it's not an easy task. You have to measure your words. You have to say, you have to know when you can speak and when you cannot speak. It's not an exercise of vanity. Thanks to him and this policy change. We just finished, we had the final conference of Horizon 2020 project, or a demo, on assessing the fiscal and monetary policy of the Union, of the EMU. And those are the things that we have learned about understanding why a crisis has specific elements within a union, and how important it was to attack and to confront the debt crisis, but also how important it has been to have an institution like the ECB, and creating more like the ESM. Mario Draghi has been always in favor of developing more institutions and institutional strength for Europe. He has practiced that, and I think we should learn from him. Think for a second how this State of the Union on solidarity in Europe would have been if euro had failed in 2012. Certainly, there will be very dramatic issues to discuss of solidarity. But the job of us as economists, when we do research, is to think about institutions and policies that will help us to avoid that situation. And when is in policy is to avoid that. Is this for today he will address talking about risk reduction and risk sharing in the European Monetary Union. So please welcome with me the former Professore dell'Università di Firenze and now President of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Marimon. Your words are too kind, even moving, but thank you. Should also say that it's quite something to speak here. I think I came here last time in a school trip a few years ago, and I had no sense of how beautiful this place is. Dear President of the European University Institute, Professor Renaud Deus, dear ambassadors, dear Vice President of the region, Ms. Monica Barney, dear members of Parliament, dear Lord Mayor, Mr. Dario Nardella, dear chairs and professors, and dear students. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be invited by the European University Institute, which in many ways mirrors what the European project is for. It was founded to encourage exchange, cooperation, and a common European vision. Since then, the university has made countless contributions in the fields of economics, law, political science, and history. It has often been the meeting point where academic research helps answer the urgent policy questions of the European Union. A decade after the financial crisis, the euro area looks set to exit more resilient than it entered it. Much of the harm caused by the economic downturn has now been reversed by a consistent period of growth. And some of the institutional and structural factors that exacerbated the crisis have been addressed. But we know that our monetary union is not complete. The crisis revealed some specific fragilities in the euro area's construction that so far have not been resolved. To make our monetary union more robust against these future challenges, we need to address these fragilities. Let me say a few words on the evolution of the crisis, because then we may be able to draw some lessons from that. The crisis took place in 5 main phases. The first phase was similar across advanced economies. Most of them had a financial sector characterized by poor risk management, low capital and liquidity, inadequate corporate governance, and weak supervision and regulation, diluted by many years of excessive optimism in the self-repairing power of the markets. When the Lehman shock hit, banks exposed to toxic US assets ran into difficulties, and some were bailed out by their governments. In the euro area, these banks were mostly located in Germany, France, and the Netherlands. Bank bailouts took place on a staggering scale. In 2009, they totaled around 8% of GDP in Germany, 5% in France, and 12% in the Netherlands. These bailouts did not greatly affect sovereign borrowing costs, however, thanks largely to the relatively strong fiscal positions of the governments implementing them. In the second phase, the crisis spread to banks in Spain and Ireland that had similar weaknesses, but were instead overexposed to the collapsing domestic real estate market. Another wave of bank bailouts followed, and some signs of tensions in sovereign debt markets began to appear. These tensions were compounded by the third phase, which began when the Greek crisis shattered the impression that public debt was risk-free, triggering a rapid repricing of sovereign risk. To those who saw the crisis as a consequence of moral hazard, this represented a required return of market discipline vis-à-vis sovereigns, a view that was reflected in the Deauville Agreement in October 2010. These events spread contagion to all sovereigns now perceived as vulnerable by financial markets. But they affected most of all those with high public debt levels, a lack of fiscal space, fragile market access, and especially low growth. Sovereign risk was then transmitted into the domestic banking sector through two channels. The first was through direct banks' exposures to their own government's bonds. Between January 2010 and July 2012, banks in Greece, Italy, and Portugal incurred aggregate losses on sovereign bonds of vulnerable countries amounting respectively to 161%, 22%, and 36% of their core Tier 1 capital. Regardless of whether these losses directly affected regulatory capital, because some of the bonds were at amortized cost in the bank's balance sheets, they had an adverse effect on perceptions of solvency in those national banking systems. And the second channel was via negative confidence effects. Because the public sector makes up roughly half the economy in many euro area countries, and because of the credit rating dynamics, the fear of possible sovereign defaults had a dramatic effect on confidence in the domestic private sector. Any distinction between firms and banks, and between banks with and without high sovereign exposures, disappeared. The general loss of confidence in these countries' prospects reverberated through the banking system via further fall in growth. In this way, the crisis spread to banks that did not have significant exposures either to the US prime assets or to domestic real estate, and therefore had not, until then, needed to be bailed out. However, governments in these countries found themselves unable to substantially respond to the emerging crisis with public money for the banking sector and with counter-cyclical fiscal policy due to lack of fiscal space and high debt. Financial markets then began to fragment along national lines, and cross-border funding dried up, exacerbated by the defensive risk management by banks and ring-fencing of liquidity by supervisors in core countries. Lack of liquidity, coupled with capital depletion from domestic losses, precipitated a renewed credit crunch. Countries were trapped in a bad equilibrium caused by the three-way link between sovereigns, banks, and domestic firms and households. Falling credit aggravated the ongoing recession, increased loan losses, and further weakened bank balance sheets, which in turn pushed sovereign borrowing costs higher. Fiscal policy, under the pressure of losing market access altogether, took mainly the more expedient route of higher taxes, which led instead to lower growth and therefore renewed market jitters, somewhat defeating its own original purpose. The fourth stage of the crisis was triggered by investors in both Europe and the rest of the world. Faced with a downward growth spiral, many investors reached the conclusion that the only way out for crisis-hit countries, given the institutional design of the euro area, was for them to exit from it. This would, it was believed, allow them to depreciate their currencies and regain monetary sovereignty. Fearing redenomination into lower value currencies, investors sold off domestic debt and private debt, further widening the spreads and exacerbating bad equilibria within vulnerable countries. In 2012, spreads vis-à-vis German 10-year government bonds reached 500 basis points in Italy and 600 basis points in Spain, with even wider spreads in Greece, Portugal, and Ireland. The fifth stage of the crisis then followed: the breakdown in monetary policy transmission across the euro area. Interest rates faced by firms and households in vulnerable countries became increasingly divorced from short-term central bank rates. As those economies represented a third of the euro area GDP, this posed a profound threat to price stability. The ECB responded with its announcement of outright monetary transaction, which was recalled by Professor Marimon a few minutes ago, which restored confidence in sovereign bond markets, helped to repair the monetary policy transmission mechanism, and broke the downward spiral. We should also remember another important event of that year, with less of a direct market impact, but fundamental in confirming to the world the strength of our leaders' commitment to the euro, was their earlier decision to create the banking union and the European Stability Mechanism. The long trip back to growth had begun. The unfolding of the euro area crisis yielded lessons for the financial sector, for individual countries, and for the Union as a whole. But the unifying theme was the inability of each of these actors to effectively absorb shocks. In some cases, because of their weaknesses, they even amplified these shocks. Indeed, banks fueled the build-up of imbalances and then exacerbated the resulting crash. Countries had too low growth potential, limited flexibility to bounce back from the crisis, and too little fiscal space to stabilize their economies. And the euro area as a whole was shown to have no public and very little private risk sharing. In the classical optimum currency area literature, what makes membership of a monetary union work for all its members is a trade-off. What they lose in terms of national stabilization tools is counterbalanced by new adjustment mechanisms within the currency area. These mechanisms are typically held to be labor and capital mobility, as well as fiscal transfers between different parts of the Union. In other words, they are ex post and take place after a recession has set in. In the United States, which is a relatively well-functioning monetary union, ex post adjustment plays an important role. Fiscal transfers through the US federal budget are estimated to absorb around 10% of the shocks, while about half of the long-run response to a rise in unemployment takes place through labor mobility. But the outcomes achieved in the United States are not substantially different to those in the euro area. Though the euro area doesn't have a large central budget, national fiscal policies can still provide significant stabilization, so long as countries can use fiscal policy freely. It is estimated that 49% of an unemployment shock is absorbed by the automatic stabilizers in the euro area, whereas the figure for the United States is 32%. And studies have found a gradual convergence in labor mobility between Europe and the United States, reflecting both a fall in interstate migration in the US and a rise in the role of migration in Europe. Where the euro area and US and the United States differ more is in terms of ex ante risk sharing. That is, insuring against shocks through financial markets. This was a concept that only appeared later in the literature on optimal currency areas, but it plays a key role in stabilizing local economies in a monetary union in two ways. The first is by delinking consumption and income at the local level, which happens through integrated capital markets. If labor income falls during a recession, but the private sector holds a diversified portfolio of financial assets, people can smooth their consumption with the financial returns they receive on assets in better performing parts of the Union. The second way is by delinking the capital of local banks from the volume of local credit supply, which happens through retail banking integration. Because local banks are typically heavily exposed to the local economy, a downturn in their home region will lead to large losses and prompt them to cut lending to all sectors. But if there are cross-border banks that operate in all parts of the Union, they can offset any losses made in the recession-hit region with gains in another, and can continue to provide credit to sound borrowers. In the US, both credit and capital market integration have played an increasingly important role in smoothing local shocks over the past decades. For example, following the oil price collapse in the mid-1980s, almost every bank in Texas failed, creating a statewide credit crunch. One reason for this was that out-of-state banks were banned from Texas market. And so the balance sheets of local banks were completely concentrated on their home state. But since then, there has been major integration in the retail banking sector, with a number of multi-state banks increasing from around 100 in the early 90s to more than 700 today. And this has significantly weakened the relationship between local capital and local credit supply. And as a result, the volatility of business cycle shocks among United States states has become smaller. Overall, it is estimated that around 70% of local shocks are smoothed through financial markets in the United States, with capital markets absorbing around 45% and credit markets about 25%. In the euro area, by contrast, the total figure is 25%. Private risk sharing, of course, has its limits. Faced with large common shocks that affect the whole monetary union, the benefits of diversification can break down, as happened to some extent in the US as well during the crisis. One study finds that capital market risk sharing in the United States dropped by almost a half in the crisis period. But this doesn't alter the conclusion that deepening private risk sharing in the euro area would be beneficial for macroeconomic stability. So the question for us is, how do we achieve it? The experience of other monetary unions and our own up to now suggests that it doesn't happen by itself. Rather, private risk sharing has to be enabled by public sector policies at both the national and the union levels. In this sense, private risk sharing cannot be seen as a substitute for further developments in the economic and monetary union. It is rather a complement to it and follows from it. The policies we need fall into two main categories. First of all, we need policies that make the financial system more stable, both by increasing the resilience of banks and by completing the banking union and the capital markets union. The euro area has already made good progress on these fronts. The post-crisis regulatory reforms have significantly strengthened the banking sector. The common equity tier 1 ratios of significant banks have risen from 8.7% in 2008 to 14.5% today. In the same period, leverage ratios have risen from 3.7 to 5.8. And banks have a much more stable liquidity and funding. The creation of European banking supervision has also brought about a more uniform approach to how banks are supervised. And the new European Union resolution framework has shifted the cost of bank failures away from sovereigns and onto the financial sector, which creates another channel of private risk sharing. Without entering into the discussion of which further regulations may be necessary for the shadow banking sector, we have to acknowledge that the banking union and the capital markets union are not yet complete. We lack a truly level playing field for cross-border banks and investors, and this stands in the way of deep financial integration. A single financial market should have one set of rules, and all market participants should be able to operate freely within it. Yet that's not the case at present. For capital markets, there are differing rules and market practices for financial products across countries, and insolvency and judicial systems vary widely. This matters because a consistent and efficient framework for pursuing failed contracts is vital to reduce uncertainty for cross-border investors. ECB analysis finds that where insolvency and judicial frameworks are more efficient, risk sharing through both capital and credit markets is higher. For banks, the single market is still fragmented along national lines. First, discrepancies in the regulatory framework reduce the economies of scale for banks operating across borders. Second, an incomplete framework for bank resolution also deters cross-border integration. When resolution is not fully credible, it can create incentives for national authorities to limit capital and liquidity flows, as we've seen, as I was saying a moment ago, during the crisis through the ring fencing that some supervisors have practiced, so that they can advantage their depositors in the event of a bank failing. But when the new EU resolution framework is completed and working properly, such concerns about depositors should be allayed. The Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive already places depositors at the top of the creditor hierarchy in resolution. And the new minimum requirements for own funds and eligible liabilities should ensure that there is a sufficient buffer or loss absorption capacity to make depositors bail-in extremely unlikely. What is still missing, however, is a backstop for the Single Resolution Fund. Resolution needs financing. And the Resolution Fund, which is funded, by the way, it's funded by banks, it's not funded by public money, will ensure that it is paid for by the private sector. But in very deep crisis, the resources of such funds could be depleted. That is why in all the other large jurisdictions, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and Japan, resolution funds are always backstopped by the fiscal authority. The aim of such backstops is not to bail banks out. Any funds borrowed are repaid by the private sector over time. Rather, the aim is to create confidence that bank resolution can always be enacted efficiently, which has a stabilizing effect in a crisis and prevents more banks from being dragged into difficulties. In other words, policies, and that's something that we'll see in a moment in other instances, in other words, policies that reduce risks for the banking system as a whole will also lead to larger risk reduction for individual banks. Let me give you an example of this. A very good example of this is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in the United States, which is also the resolution authority and is backstopped by a credit line with the US Treasury. During the crisis, around 500 banks were resolved in the United States without triggering financial instability. In contrast, one estimate puts the total number of banks resolved in the euro area in that period at around 50. An orderly resolution of this magnitude was possible in the United States because of confidence in a well-functioning resolution framework. And the presence of the Treasury backstop was fundamental in creating this confidence. Indeed, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance, ultimately didn't have to draw on its credit line, but it was clearly reassuring to markets and to depositors that it had that option as a last resort. In fact, the FDIC has borrowed from the Treasury only once, during the savings and loans crisis in the early 90s, and it did repay in full a few years later. This example underlines that the dichotomy between risk reduction and risk sharing that characterizes the debate today is in many ways artificial. With the right policy framework, these two goals are mutually reinforcing. Public risk sharing through backstops helps reduce risks across the system by containing market panics when a crisis hits. And a strong resolution framework ensures that when bank failures do happen, very little public risk sharing is actually needed, as the costs are fully borne by the private sector. So we need to put things first things first, and complete the resolution framework in all its dimensions. And creating a properly designed European deposit insurance scheme would be an additional element that could further reduce the risk of bank runs. All in all, a consistent framework of regulations, laws, judicial enforcement, and resolution is essential for deep and resilient financial integration. Completing the banking union and the capital markets union is therefore a necessary condition for the expansion of private risk sharing in the euro area. Yet, it's not a sufficient condition. And this brings me to the second area where public sector policies can complement private risk sharing by increasing economic convergence and thereby building trust among cross-border investors. The crisis showed clearly the potential of some euro area economies to become trapped in bad equilibria. And plainly, as long as this risk exists, it will act as a deterrent to cross-border integration, especially for retail banks that cannot cut and run as soon as the recession hits. Put simply, we will not be able to foster private risk sharing in our union if crisis can call its very integrity into question. So if we are to deepen private risk sharing, the tail risk of bad equilibria needs to be removed and replaced by policies that lead to sustainable convergence. This requires action at both the national and euro area levels. In the eyes of many observers, three features made countries vulnerable to downward spirals: weak banks, lack of fiscal space, and low growth. Stabilizing the financial sector in the ways I've just described would address one part of the problem. But the common factor uniting all three was growth. Very low growth rates reduced fiscal space and harmed bank balance sheets. At the national level, structural reforms, therefore, remain a priority. We know that structural reforms boost growth. Looking at the last 15 to 20 years, euro area countries with sound economic structures at the outset have shown much higher long-term real growth. And we know that they help countries recover more quickly from shocks, which prevents recessions from leaving lasting scars. That said, while sound domestic policies are key to protect countries from market pressure, the crisis showed that in certain conditions, they may not be enough. Markets tend to be procyclical and can penalize sovereigns that are perceived to be vulnerable over and above what may be needed. Over and above what may be needed to restore a sustainable fiscal path. And this overshooting can harm growth and ultimately worsen fiscal sustainability. And this creates a need for some form of common stabilization function to prevent countries from diverging too much during crisis, as has already been acknowledged with the creation of the European facilities to tackle bad equilibria. One of these facilities, of course, is the ECB's OMT. which can be used when there is a threat to euro area price stability and comes with an ESM program. The other one is the ESM itself. But the conditionality attached to its programs in general also implies procyclical fiscal tightening. So we need an additional fiscal instrument to maintain convergence during large shocks without having to overburden monetary policy. Its aim will be to provide an extra layer of stabilization, thereby reinforcing confidence in national policies. It's not conceptually simple to design such an instrument, as it should not, among many other complexities, compensate for weaknesses that can and should be addressed by national policies and national reforms. It's not legally simple, because such instruments should be consistent with the treaty. And as we've seen from our long-standing discussions, it's certainly not politically simple. But regardless of the shape that such instrument can take, from the provision of supranational public goods like security, defense, migration, to a full-fledged fiscal capacity, the argument whereby risk sharing may help to greatly reduce risk, or whereby, in other words, solidarity in some specific circumstances contributes to efficient risk reduction, is compelling in this case as well. And our work on the design and proper time frame of such an instrument should continue. Let me conclude my presentation saying that this year the ECB is celebrating its 20th birthday, and next year we'll be able to mark the 20 years of the euro. In those 2 decades, the euro has become a feature of our lives and a symbol of our European identity. 3/4 of euro area citizens now support the single currency. And when people are asked to name the most important elements of their European identity, the euro is the second element they cite, after the values of democracy and freedom. The people of Europe have come to know the euro and trust the euro, but they also expect the euro to deliver the stability and the prosperity it promised. So, our duty as policymakers is to return their trust and to address the areas of our union that we all know are incomplete. Thank you.
Facciamo che loro vengano su? Sì, sì, e poi guarda. Lo dico a loro? Chi ha la scheda per fare
C'è
sedere?
Daisy ed Elisa. Fanno loro. Scusa.
Mr. Sandlo? Mr. Sandlo?
Hi, yes.
Hi.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, yeah.
Sì, sì. Stanno mettendo là?
May I ask everyone to please take your seats? Please take your seats so that we can begin. This afternoon's session is called It's Time to Get the House in Order, How to Strengthen the Current EMU. Martin Sandbu, the economics commentator of the Financial Times, will introduce our distinguished panel and moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello? Is this microphone working? It is working. If you'll please find your seats, we will try to perform the impossible feat of following Mario Draghi's discussion on the euro. I am Martin Sandbu from the Financial Times. Thanks to the EUI for organizing this session. It's a particularly exciting time, I think, to be discussing euro reform, because there is a sense of political momentum in that there's a commitment to agreeing something at the European Council in June, but at the same time political divisions remain, it seems, almost as deep as ever, and President Draghi referred to them. So nobody really knows what's going to happen in June. That makes it an exciting, if somewhat trepidating and confusing time to be discussing this. But the panel up here on stage with me is the best qualified group of people I can think of to try to make sense of what should and may and will happen. They are among the best thinkers and advisors and also officials and decision makers on euro reform, having been deeply involved in understanding and trying to manage the crisis. Since we're behind time and we have 6 people in addition to me on the panel, I'll just very briefly introduce you all in alphabetical order from my right to my left. Marco Butti is the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the Commission, marked by time in the trenches in the Eurozone crisis. Lars-Peter Feld is a Professor of Economic Policy, also a member of the German Council of Economic Experts, advising the government and the German public. Jean Pisani-Ferry's most relevant title now is that you are the Padua-Schioppa Chair at the EUI. But Jean has had deep influence on the euro debate and also on French policy formulation. Lucrezia Reiklin is a professor of economics at the London Business School, but it's even more exciting that you were mentioned as a potential prime minister of a technical government until that was suddenly off this week. Rolf Strauch is the chief economist at one of these new institutions Mario Draghi referred to that have helped to stabilize the euro, the European Stability Mechanism. And Paul Thompson, last but not least, Director of the European Department at the International Monetary Fund, and also somebody who's been burnt in the trenches of the Eurozone debt crisis. If people could try to fall quiet in the back, it'll be easier for everyone to hear us and for us to hear one another. Since it's a panel with a lot of people. I encourage you again to be as succinct as you can, because I would like to open up to questions from the audience as we move along. Lucrezia, I'd like to start with a question for you. Mario Draghi was very clear that in addition to private risk sharing, there needs to be some form of public risk sharing. And the issue of a fiscal stability or a fiscal taxpayer-backed risk-sharing mechanism is both something that many say is the most crucial element needed to strengthen the euro, and also the one that's politically the most difficult. So can you give us your take on why we need it, how badly we need it, how bad would it be if we don't get it very far on it?
Thank you for introducing me. I think I was very happy that actually Mario Draghi put a lot of emphasis on the issue of the fiscal capacity, because I think that this is one of the least well understood issue in the discussion on policy reform. So what is it about? When we talk about fiscal capacity, what do we really mean? We are talking about a response to large shocks, to crises. We are not talking about business as usual. So that's the first element. And why is it important to have a tool to guarantee fiscal capacity in these situations? Because facing those shocks, the ensemble of our rules induce procyclicality. So that means that there is a tendency for euro area countries to consolidate during bad times. And this is what happened since the third quarter of 2009. And this is what actually, in my view, it is one of the reasons why the euro area as a whole, not Greece, the euro area as a whole, performed worse than the United States as a whole. So this is what we are talking about, is a tool for stabilization during bad time. There are questions of how to design such stabilization fund, to provide fiscal capacity. And there is also, people who think that this tool maybe is useless because the monetary policy actually will have that function during bad times. So we don't need a fiscal instrument. I think actually we do need a fiscal instrument, because during those times monetary policy becomes ineffective, or is less effective, because the interest rates are zero. So that in those situations the traditional tools of monetary policy are not enough. We need monetary policy coordination, and such stabilization tool is the vehicle through which to achieve that goal. The other thing is that we don't want to have the ECB to do too much, because at the end of the story, this will also be dangerous for governance issues and will be highly divisive. So I think that this is actually a very important part of the euro reform that we need to think about it.
Lucrezia, thank you. Again, can I just ask the audience, this is a beautiful room, but not one with very beautiful acoustics. So please keep the conversations maybe outside the room if you don't want to listen to what the panelists have to say. Jean Pisani-Ferry, you were among 14 authors of a policy recommendation document this winter that caused quite a lot of waves, 7 French, 7 German, and partly for that reason was quite politically important. That document embraced the idea of restructuring sovereign debt. Embraced is maybe too strong, but defended it, allowed for it, and you have done so individually as well, and actually come in for quite a lot of criticism for it, including from your home country, which seems quite set against debt restructuring. Can you tell us why you think it's needed?
Thank you. Yeah, it elicited criticism from my own country, from this country, from many quarters. And I think this is an issue on which is easily misunderstanding and suspicion. So let me be clear about what we're saying in this paper, also co-authored by Jeroen Zettelmeijer, who is here. What we're saying is that monetary union must have an anchor. If there is no anchor, it means that we run the risk of what economists call fiscal dominance, which is the risk that monetary policy is determined by fiscal needs to keep states solvent, and that's not a recipe for a stable monetary union. So the Maastricht system had essentially one preventive anchor, that was the Stability Pact, and one sort of limit, that was the no bailout clause. The Stability Pact, in our view, is technically broken and politically vulnerable. The no bailout clause means different things to different people, to the point when it's not clear what it means today. So what we're saying is that this should be repaired, and this should be repaired in a way that does not create instability, but rather create stability. What does it mean? Some people say just do nothing, because it works now. We feel it's dangerous because that doesn't determine the conditions, the limit conditions for monetary union. Some people are tempted to say, Mario Draghi alluded to it, let's use the threat of a forced exit as a disciplinary device. We feel that would be extremely dangerous because it would mean that the euro would be turned again into a sort of fixed exchange rate system. There can be crises. Those crises have to be solved inside the euro area, not by forcing exit. The third option that some people advocate is some form of automatic triggers. So this can be numerical triggers. Above a certain threshold, you restructure, or it can be a procedural trigger. If you go for an ESM program, you have to restructure. We feel both are dangerous. The numerical triggers are dangerous because they don't take into account the characteristic of the economy, the potential growth rate that can differ from one country to another. The procedural trigger that shouldn't be considered because, after all, Ireland and Portugal went through an ESM program and they're solvent. So it means you can go through an ESM program and remain solvent. What we propose is a set of principles. First, that we say national governments should be given more autonomy. There should be an expenditure rule. They should be free to, spend up to the expenditure rule, and if above, they can issue bonds in the form of junior bonds. We should agree on the definition of the no bailout clause, which should be that there should be no lending to a country that is not solvent. Restructuring should be part of the toolbook as a last resort option without any numerical threshold, but based on the analysis of the sustainability. And to make it credible, the cost of restructuring should be reduced, meaning the cost should be reduced for banks, and the cost should be reduced for states by limiting the power of holdout creditors. And in order to avoid that this possibility of restructuring creates fear and therefore leads to excessively pro-cyclical policies, there should be liquidity provision and there should be stabilization, which brings us back to this fiscal capacity. So that's what we're saying. And what does it require? It requires an institution that's able to do it in a credible way and in an independent way. So that's a requirement for the ESM. It requires also that the terms of lending are made precise enough, because obviously you can say, I'm going to make a country solvent by lending to it at whatever rate is needed to make it solvent, and that would not be a proper definition. But it requires some discipline on the definition of the instrument and some credibility on the part of the institution.
But this, to be clear, this is fully compatible with a fiscal capacity stabilization
That's
instrument,
exactly what
right?
I said, that it's perfectly, not only it's complementary to the fiscal capacity and stabilization. The more you introduce this possibility, it involves some risk, and those risks have, in part, to be taken care of by this liquidity provision and stabilization.
So both of these points are, in a sense, about repairing the sort of institutional structure that didn't work the last time around and completing what was missing in it. But there's still a question of the damage left over from lack of discipline in the run-up to the crisis, perhaps permanently lost output after the crisis. So we have these overhangs of debt. Lars-Peter Feld, I'd like you to talk about how you think about the overhang both of public debt, large public debt burdens, especially in the most crisis-hit countries, but also an issue that's politically divisive on the private side, large stocks of non-performing loans, bad assets on banks' balance sheets that seem to have been a political stumbling block in progressing in the direction of risk sharing.
Yeah. In replying your question, let me share two experiences that I've made in the last couple of years. First was the creation of the German debt brake in 2009, which I could help to design in some regard. And the other one was the European Debt Redemption Pact by the German Council of Economic Experts. And this ERP is highlighting the problems we are facing here very much. Because the ERP tried to do things in three different perspectives. First of all, a compromise, solving the conflict, solving the trade-off between financial stabilization on the one side and moral hazard on the other side. If you remember what it consisted of, there was one pillar which meant a kind of mutualization of government debt up to a certain level in the European Monetary Union. And on the other side, the second pillar was collateral adjustment programs and so on, in order to ensure that the different member states repay their government debt to this European Debt Redemption Fund within the 30 years that we would have needed in the case of Italy. This kind of compromise is underlying all the different proposals that I've seen. So it's underlying the idea of the 14 French and German economists, it's underlying other proposals, and I don't see a really first best solution to this trade-off that we currently observe. And the reason for that simply is we have huge legacy issues still in the European Monetary Union regarding public debt on the one side and private indebtedness in the case of unfunded non-performing loans on the other side in the banking systems. And somehow this must be solved before we can go bigger steps forward in the architecture of the European Monetary Union. There are no easy solutions for that. So for example, if you start with a debt restructuring, in any case, it will lead to disaster in the European Monetary Union. I don't think that we can have that currently. Think about a Deauville moment. When we have debt restructuring, it can only be relevant or in place in a couple of years' time. What we also can see in this case of the European Debt Redemption Pact and all the other exercises of compromise solutions that come up is a kind of contractual problem that we face here. How do you manage to ensure that a country is sticking to this contract in a 30-year time, which is very difficult to achieve in practice in legal terms? And I have not found this solution in the European Debt Redemption Pact, and I'm not so sure whether we find this solution now. You are always stuck with two general principles in international law, which is the pacta sunt servanda on the one side and the rebus sic stantibus on the other side. This is what we always have. We currently face it in the Iranian crisis as well. So this is the problem that we are in. My conclusion from this problem is simply saying, well, we can try to find out possibilities to draw on future resources on the one, in the one or the other fashion, but this is also very difficult to achieve in these contractual terms. So we are not getting rid of the necessity to have national governments doing their responsibility and reducing their exposure to future crises by reducing public debt on the one side and cleaning bank balance sheets on the other side by reducing non-performing loans. This is what we need. And actually, when we are looking more carefully, the main problem is Italy. And I want to spell that out directly here, because this is important to solve. If this country is not solving its problems, we are facing huge difficulties in the European Monetary Union in the future.
And just to follow up on that, it's not just a political imperative to deal with the legacy issues, it's that any other solution will not work economically even. Have I understood you right?
Yeah. That's what I was saying.
Another proposal that's in the air is to change or build up the European Stability Mechanism into a European Monetary Fund. I confess that I never quite know what people mean when they talk about an EMF. But Rolf Strauch, you probably have a definition in mind, and certainly your institution will have some view about what an EMF should look like, what it should be built up to be. So could you share that with us?
Yes, Martin, thank you very much. Happy to do that. I think this discussion around the European Monetary Fund is essentially closely linked to the discussion on the deepening of EMU. And therefore, a lot of what was said before kind of also cuts into that element of reform agenda. Now, after the last Euro summit in December, President Tusk formulated a mandate for the Eurogroup to work on this deepening EMU reform agenda, and he identified 2 points to work on where he saw most consensus. One point was banking union, the other point is the role of the ESM. Both, and also the role of the ESM, are very closely related to what Mario Draghi said about making the euro area more robust, building confidence. And in that context, there are 4 points I think that one can mention. The first one, there's a relative strong consensus that the ESM could be the common backstop to the Single Resolution Fund. And Mario Draghi has eloquently explained how that adds to confidence building. A second element is to give the ESM a stronger role in crisis resolution by developing its mandate so that it can jointly with the Commission design, monitor, negotiate programs and policy conditionality. On those, in that area as well, there's quite a strong consensus. The third element then relates more to the fiscal area, and here views become more diverse, and they're related to the fiscal capacity that was also mentioned before, and the question whether one could have in the euro area a financial stabilization tool that kicks in before a country loses market access. And there's also the idea that possibly the ESM could have a shorter term fiscal stabilization facility that gives this kind of macroeconomic support. And then there's the fourth area, and here already Jean Pisani-Ferry explained very nicely the rationale about it. It's the question how to think about sustainability problems, public debt sustainability problems, forward-looking, and whether we could think about a framework how to handle it, maybe somewhat clearer than we were able to do so in the past. This has nothing to do with automatism of debt restructuring, very clearly, but those people who think that one needs to handle those problems, when they are actually there, then there could also be a possibility for the ESM to have a clearer role in that process that somewhat also relates to what the IMF is doing at an international scale. Taking all that together, some people have coined the name and think and talk of a European Monetary Fund, but frankly speaking, for me, the name is kind of a secondary issue. It's not really what matters. What matters is what the ESM, what we as an institution can indeed do to make the euro area more robust. And I think there we can indeed play a useful role along the lines that I said.
If this is a model, on your view, would that deal with the need for a fiscal capacity? Could you then have a stable eurozone without another sort of fiscal stabilization tool? Would it be enough?
Well, there are very different proposals on a stabilization tool that can have the form of an unemployment insurance scheme, that can have the form of rainy day funds, that can also have the form of this kind of short-term lending facility that I alluded to before, which may overall be, depending on the size, more limited than what some people have in mind, but it would be one option that has certain advantages and can certainly help to stabilize the euro area more.
Paul Thompson, the International Monetary Fund doesn't have a seat at the European Summit, thank goodness, many will say, but financial stability is the raison d'etre of the IMF. So you and your institution have your views about what financial stability in the euro area for the long term would look like. We've heard about some of the various political and indeed economic dilemmas that have to be solved and maybe will not be solved. Given the political constraints and the feasibility constraints, if you were to advise the European Council in June on where they should put in their effort in terms of concluding something, what would it be? What's most important?
Yeah, if there really is a constraint on political capital that can be spent, I would certainly, I hope we would see the beginning of fiscal, countercyclical fiscal capacity in June. But if there is a significant constraints on what can be achieved, I would hope that I would suggest that one start with completing the banking union and complete the capital market union. This is an area where Europe already has come quite a long way with the introduction of the single resolution mechanism, the SSM, the BRD, etc. Much has been achieved, but I think there's still quite a long way to go, and these European institutions are still to an important extent hamstrung by national institutions and national regulations, and I think this is an area where I would recommend to spend limited capital to essentially be in a situation, if there's a limited ability to politically create the institution needed for risk sharing, so facilitate that the market does it, facilitate that the markets create more risk sharing by completing banking union and completing capital market union. For all the reasons that Mario Draghi mentioned before, that's where I would apply my limited political capital if I have it. Now, this is something that to some extent is technical, the single rule books of the Commission and harmonization of insolvency frameworks, etc. So it's something that perhaps could be done by experts, but I would warn against underestimating the political difficulties here too. This will run into significant vested interest, fierce resistance from local interest, but I think this is where I would spend my limited capital. But I think it's also critical at the same time that we continue with enforcing the fiscal rules. I am concerned about that we are at a very strong point in the cycle where growth is well above potential for the euro area as a whole, and a number of highly indebted countries are, given the strength of the cycle, simply not doing enough to build fiscal buffers going forward. And I think this is an important issue at this juncture.
Just on the vested interests that are opposed even to the more realistic reforms, can you be a bit more specific?
Yeah, I mean, I would invite you to read the article in the Frankfurt Allgemein from the last weekend on resistance, for instance, in Germany to harmonizing regulatory framework. The fact is that national regulators are concerned about allowing banks to take deposits locally and do banking across the borders because they are concerned that they will be on the hook for if something goes wrong for protecting these depositors. So there are legitimate concerns here. There's legitimate concerns, but I do think we have the European institutions, so strengthen the European institutions, and that will give credibility to that the enforcement of the rule is not hostage to local interest, but to a broad set of rules as applied at the European level. I think that's the way forward.
I see some of the panelists are getting nervous because there's a clock here that says we have 3 minutes left, but we have about half an hour left, so ignore that. Although, stay succinct. Marco, I've waited with you until the last sort of first round, the end of the first round, because you're sort of at the center of the web of economic decision-making in Europe and in the Eurozone in your position at the Commission. So I'd like to ask you, we've heard a lot about maybe must-haves, nice-to-haves, important things to have. Can you tell us what we are actually likely to get in your view, and will it be enough?
Okay, thank you, Martin. Let me say first of all that it's particularly moving for me to be here. So I feel a bit like l'enfant du pays. President Draghi said it, I think it's, for me, it's, multiplied. Now, on what are we going to get from the June European Council? First of all, I think it's a very important rendezvous because after that, we are very quickly going to get into the electoral cycle, and so I think progress and breakthrough are unlikely to come after that. So what can we achieve? What are the criteria, let's say, to judge whether it's a success or not? I would select actually 3 criteria. Okay, the first one, we have to see concrete deliverables with a clear calendar time path for the agreement. The second one is, I think we have to make sure that we move away from the zero-sum game mentality. So try to see whether there is a win-win out of that. And I think the third one is improving towards, moving more and more towards a common narrative, which, to be frank, we still do not have fully between countries. Now, if you take these 3 criteria, how would you fit the possible deliverables in that? On the first one, concrete deliverables, I think President Draghi gave a very, very clear message. It's on the banking union side. I think what can be achieved in June is a clear agreement, political agreement, not yet, let's say, legal, on the backstop for the Single Resolution Fund. I think this is clear. I think and the outcome is not a surprise, is not mysterious. I think it's going to be the ESM, has to be the ESM providing the backstop for the Single Resolution Fund. I would put in that also, and here it becomes more tricky, some progress on the common deposits, so on the EDIS type. Here the Commission has put forward proposals which are in stages. So the first one, which is the liquidity support between different deposit guarantee systems, so no risk sharing, no mutualization of losses. So liquidity support, I think, can help and could be agreed rather quickly. It is not there yet, but I think we can do that. Now, second, still in the category of clear deliverables, I think Rolf mentioned that, is some strengthening of the power of the ESM. I think on this front, whatever we can do in terms of improving crisis prevention, so precautionary access to precautionary facilities, something which is akin to a fiscal stabilization to prevent countries from losing market access. I think this is certainly something we can agree upon. The second one is on, say, moving away from the zero-sum game. Now, on this, I've listened to Paul. I think he's right. We have limited political capital. But the limited political capital is probably elastic if you choose the right projects and the right measures. So I think in this category here, I will put decisive progress in capital markets union, and in particular linking that to the many proposals that we have to boost investment. President Juncker mentioned this morning the proposal of the MFF for the next 7 years after 2020. I think here there is a proposal for Invest EU. I think guarantees from the EU budget to boost investment. So if we have a narrative here, capital markets union, move to towards an investment financing union, I think is a way to move away from the zero-sum game, because it is, capital markets union, EU Invest, I think is less politically, I would say, less ideologically charged than the other issues. So I think I see this as a way to make political capital more elastic. And I think on the third one, is the narrative, so coming closer to a common narrative. I think this is very important. I will put in that category the proposals on the fiscal stabilization, where I think we have more work to do. I think President Draghi was very clear. I think it's, more work can be done. The Commission has made some proposals for investment protection scheme in last weeks. Rolf mentioned the role of the ESM. I think more can be done on that to come closer to a common narrative. I think in this, and I close on this, is the articulation between risk sharing and risk reduction. I think President Draghi was absolutely correct that this dichotomy here, I think it is useful in the debate, but at the end of the day, we have to be very clear in what we put into the different buckets. And actually, there are certain measures which classically are put in the risk sharing side, which actually help in the risk reduction side. Fiscal capacity is one of them. Thanks.
It's interesting how you talk about the narrative, because I was thinking about how Lars was worried about the legacy issues in terms of actual economic legacies. You're almost talking about a problem of intellectual legacy, that we still don't share a narrative of what went wrong and therefore what needs to be fixed. I guess there's a way to interpret that in an optimistic way, that it means that we can do work on the economic policy of things where we do have more or less a shared narrative, the banking union more or less, but then put political energy into getting to a better understanding to keep political momentum on the other issues. Lars, I'd like you to come in on what I take to be a reasonably optimistic view of what could happen in June. Your worries about the outstanding legacies, the financial legacy problems, do they mean that this is too optimistic, that even if this is agreed, it's not good enough?
Well, I would say it is too optimistic, yes. But I share the view that regarding completion of banking union, an agreement on a fiscal backstop for the resolution fund will be achieved finally. But much depends on how the NPLs in the banking system are solved and how quickly we can come down. What are the thresholds that must be achieved in the different member states in order to allow the fiscal backstop to be in place. I think that's an important step, and we have not talked very much about on the interaction between the fiscal backstop for the single resolution fund on the one side and EDIS on the other side. It depends on the design of this fiscal backstop, on what do you allow, how large it is, how important it could be, and perhaps EDIS is not necessary then, because the political struggle on EDIS is going to be much more strongly than it's going to be on the fiscal backstop. I give you an example from the German case. We have the savings banks at the local and regional level. In the boards of the savings banks, the mayors of the different cities and communities are represented. Any representative in the Bundestag, any politician there is dependent on local support by the mayor of his community, which is ensuring that the electorate is on his side. And so it is going to be very difficult to do anything against the savings banks in Germany. And EDIS is a strong case for them. So I can understand from the European Union case, or European Union point of view, that this is of course vested interest that is there, the savings banks in Germany only, but still they are politically powerful and we should keep that in mind. So I would focus intellectually much more strongly on the design of this fiscal backstop for the single resolution fund in order to ensure that banking union is working properly. And I think we should also not forget, given the common narrative or a new narrative for the European Union, the importance of security issues. They also have, or could have, a strong budgetary impact. They do not necessarily have in the MFF currently, although there is something in that proposal now. But there is the potential to have an increase of budgetary items for security in the future. And when I think about federalization in other areas of the world in history, think about the US, Canada, Switzerland, Australia, Germany, Austria, the six classical federations, so to speak, the security issue has always been in the center of their interest to become a federation. And when you want to push the European Union further in that direction, security is very, very important. And it also has strong insurance elements, so to speak. Of course, also redistribution elements. Where is the army located in Switzerland? It's in the rural, poor areas of the Swiss cantons. It's not in Zurich or Bern or Basel. And this is what you should keep in mind as well.
I think it's a historical pattern that the first common fiscal instrument is usually war financing. I've just been shown a sign saying we have 10 minutes left, which is 10 minutes less than I was originally told. So I'd like to open up to get at least one round of questions from the audience, and then let the panelists get a chance to answer and comment on each other. But are there any questions? Could you raise your hands, because with the dim light it's a bit hard to. If there are no questions, I have plenty of questions. So I don't see anyone bursting to ask a question, so I'm going to go on. I'd like to follow up where we were. So it seems like the view about what's most realistic to expect from June is decent progress on central elements of banking union, the backstop for resolving banks, maybe harder on EDIS, but on some of the other bigger fiscal debt and public debt issues, maybe not much more than progress towards a common narrative. So would that be, I'd like to hear from the other panelists, whether that would be something to welcome, would it be a totally wasted opportunity, how positive should we be about an outcome like that? Who would like to start? Jean?
Let me go back to this, the nature of the deadlock. There are basically two approaches. One is to say, let's work on the sort of longer term goal, the policy system, not assuming that you're starting from any particular situation, thinking about the property of the system and how the system deals with accidents. And this assumes that participants in the discussion are willing to enter without thinking they're themselves in a particular situation, a particular position. You know, Ken Rogoff said that banking crises are equal opportunity threats. That means all countries have gone through banking crises, rich and poor. So you cannot say ex ante which kind of country is going to have a banking crisis. So let's think about the way the system should work in order to be robust and resilient with respect to such crises. Now, the experience we're having is that it's very difficult to think in these ways. That there's a lot of resistance, and that some participants think, we are going to be on the side of the creditors. And I think in Germany, the dominant thinking is that we are going to be always on the side of the creditors, which is not true, neither theoretically nor historically. But that's a mindset. If this is the case, then we have to change approach. We have to start from the situation as it is, which is what you said, which is much more difficult. We start from a situation when there are true creditors and debtors. And here we have divergent interests. We have those who have to pay and those who have to receive. But if we're unable to approach the issue from a systemic standpoint, at some point we'll have to approach it from a different standpoint, which is let's start from the situation where it is, and let's accept that there are going to be some costs to be borne.
Some of the choices made in the crisis reinforce that view of things, I think, that there are two types of countries.
Yes, but we have the luxury of being in a benign situation where we can think about the longer term properties without having to draw conclusions immediately. That's in the crisis, we had to draw conclusions immediately. We had to address the problem of this or that country. Now we are in a benign situation and we can think, and that's what Mario Draghi proposed, think about the properties of the system, think about how the system should work. But that requires a degree of willingness on the part of the participant to enter this type of discussion. And I'm afraid it's very difficult to find it.
Who wants to come in? I've seen Marco. Lucrezia first.
Well, I would say that, don't forget that we have gone a long way, so that we have had 10 years of crisis and 10 years of reform, so which is not nothing. So I think we have come a long way also in trying to build a little bit of a common narrative, but we are not there yet. And I don't think that in this phase we will come to any substantial further steps. Okay, I don't anticipate that this is going to happen. And okay, how bad is that? Okay, how much in a risky situation that's put us? Well, if you think that the financial crisis is around the corner, I would say that the euro area is still very vulnerable, and then we have to think that the next financial crisis will make the further step. But maybe, and we are in Italy and I'm Italian, so I think that everything has been discussed by all of us, all our reports and so on trying to design these different funds and so on and so forth, that don't really take care of the problem of a country like Italy, which has very low potential growth and very high legacy public debt. So we have like a Japanese situation in the monetary union, and I don't think we have even started thinking about what kind of deal would, take care of that kind of risk, which, is there. And we cannot deal with it like the Japanese central bank is doing, so we have to find other ways. And this discussion will come on the table sooner or later, and is not on the June table, but it will come very soon, I think.
Paul, and then back to Marco, and then this time the clock here is for real, so I think we're going to have to stop after that, I'm afraid. So be brief. If you're very brief, there's time for the others too.
On your question on whether we would be happy with what was out here, yes, definitely. As I said, this is a good way to spend limited capital, a common backstop for the resolution fund, and some sort of plan for deposit insurance that links to risk reduction. I completely agree with that, but we cannot stop there. It is critical that we strengthen the SGP and that we build the fiscal, the central fiscal capacity over the medium term. I repeat, I do think that the risks are building up in the system. If we don't use these very good times to build more fiscal space. I think this is the critical challenge. And whatever we discuss here, whatever I have heard, single resolution, backstop for single resolution fund, will not fundamentally change the ability of a country down the road to avoid significant pro-cyclical policies in the response to the next crisis, unless they build fiscal space now. We can, whatever we think, there are many good proposals on architecture, and we should go for them. But they will not fundamentally change whatever I hear is feasible. How a country will be able to avoid significant pro-cyclical tightening when the next downturn, or not to speak about shock, hits.
Rolf, can you be very quick before I go to Marco?
I think an encouraging element, at least, that one needs to keep in mind is the fact that what we are discussing now, as compared to what we achieved already and the quantum leaps in integration that were achieved, is relatively small. That relates to banking union, where the true steps were already made. And also if you think about crisis resolution, the fiscal means put up there are way larger than what we are discussing now. So at least that, I think, is an encouraging point that we should keep in mind.
Marco.
I would like to take up Jean's point on creditors and debtors. Let's be clear. Never reforms have been done under what economists love, which would be the veil of ignorance. Go back to Bretton Woods and the debate between Harry Dexter White and Maynard Keynes. We knew who the creditor was and who the debtor was. But, and there is a big but, in the European Union, of all the divisions that we have, North, South, new member states, old member states, small countries, large countries, the distinction, the division between debtors and creditors is the ugliest one. And we have to overcome that one there. And if you take a dynamic perspective on this, Creditors today can be the debtor of tomorrow. In the current environment, with the risks that we have on trade, the external dependence of countries that we know, things can turn around very quickly. So I think, yes, let's start from where we are, acknowledging the realities, but let's do that in an open, dynamic way in which one does not optimize only taking into account the short-term interest of your country, but the general economic interest of the euro area and the EU.
Thank you. I just want to kind of mention a couple of points I noticed in this discussion, which we unfortunately have to bring to an end. One is Italy really matters, both financially but also politically. Something has to be found that works both in Italy and for Italy. And the other point is that the biggest challenges to the Eurozone are probably not economical and technical, but rather this political effort to try to find some sort of common way of defining these interests. And then the technical bits can be sorted. That's precisely why this sort of gathering is useful, to try to create meetings of minds. So I'd like to thank all of you panelists and all of you for attending, and enjoy the rest of the remaining sessions. Thank you.
By your chair, or take care of you down there?
Vabbè, comunque parla Gentiloni, lei dice grazie, ci vediamo il prossimo anno, appena finisce il parlare faccio scusare di
Will you please take your seats? It is now my honor to introduce, as our final speaker, Paolo Gentiloni, the Prime Minister of Italy.
Thank you very much. Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, authorities, Mr. President of the European University Institute, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that considering that in the past 2 days there has been a debate on the perspectives and the future, the principles of the Union, on the principle of the Union, I think it is important that all this takes place in a city such as Florence, a great European capital city, and that an event such as this is organized under the auspices, so to say, of the European University Institute. And it is an example of excellence in this field, but it's also the first example of a large design of common European education, which is one of the concrete utopias of the Union. I would like to remind you that recently in Göteborg, during one of the European Councils, we talked about it, especially because of the input of Mr. Macron and our input. We talked about this idea of a European excellence in terms of European universities, research center. It is one more reason to be grateful to the institute that for many years now has been gathering us here for the State of the Union, which is taking place during an important moment. So the next elections in Europe will take place next year, and they will mark the end of cycle, a 10-year cycle that has seen Europe going through different stages, but all very relevant stages with important impacts on the citizens, the public opinion. Next year, the State of the Union will take place either during the electoral campaign or just after the elections. And we have certainly experienced the most serious crisis of the European project in its 60 years of existence. And we experienced it in the first 5-6 years of this decade because of the adding up of the economic crisis and then the migration crisis was added to it, and all this created a crisis of trust in the European Union. Someone said that after Brexit, a sort of 1989 turned upside down to show how hard the blow had been. And that sign, I mean the British referendum, we don't have to forget about it. The slogan that was the soul of the electoral campaign to leave, the take back control with which the supporters of Leave won the referendum. So let's take back the control of our country. Well, this is a slogan that somehow is the result of that perfect storm between migration crisis, economic crisis, and lack of trust towards the European institutions. And also, if we think the theme of this year's of the State of the Union, i.e. solidarity, is also the result of a defect of solidarity or a level of solidarity which is not good enough, because we don't have to forget, and I'm saying it as a convinced supporter of Europe and of the European institutions, we can't forget that faced with the economic risk, very often the countries that were more in difficulties were depicted as being wasters. And we don't have to forget that the efforts that these countries made in the past 10 years in terms of reforms has been a huge effort. If you take a look at the map of the 28 European countries. And if one wonders about where the most incisive reforms and also the most difficult reforms were brought about, also in relation to the public opinion, well, I guess in the end, if we talk about the last 10 years and not about the last 20 or 25 years, so if we limit ourselves to think about the last 10 years, these countries are Italy, Spain, France, they're still doing it, Portugal, Greece. Well, one might say, well, they were in such a state. They were in a difficult situation, but this would open a very long debate on the euro and how we went from a competition to a different context. Of course, a part of Europe has experienced that period as a time when solidarity certainly lacked. And in Italy too, this was felt. The same feeling of being faced with some delay or reluctance, faced with the migration crises that have exploded with the extent that we have seen in an almost unexpected way, very suddenly. Federica Mogherini, Mrs. Mogherini is here with us, and I mean, we organized the first European Council when we dealt with the theme that then very quickly became the crucial topic for almost all public opinions in Europe. But we talked about it for the first time in the summer, in May probably, of 2015, after the shipwreck just off the coasts of Libya, organized by Mr. Renzi. And this to say that, I mean, so this additional difficulty has landed on our table in an unexpected way, because and then we had to deal with the Brexit and the impact on the elections and so on and so forth. But we know that faced with the most dramatic moment of crisis of the European design, crisis in terms of trust on the part of the citizens in many countries, actually the Union has been able to react. And has been able to react because if one were to say on which basis, well, I think that basically it reacted because with the awareness of the citizens and the public opinion in various European countries, that the heritage of peace, dialogue, prosperity, and sharing represented by the Union was in any way much stronger, even of the perfect storm of crises that we went through. It was a common heritage. I have to say, I have seen this response being born from a psychological point of view in Rome in March, when we celebrated 60 years of the treaties of the European Union. Those of you who were present there, well, you might remember that there was a climate, an atmosphere of a willingness to react against these crises. We were 9 months after the Brexit. There was this willingness of going back to believe in the European project. I have seen this response also in the doubts of of Great Britain, the UK, because after the referendum, they went through a difficult patch. Theresa May was round here, not far from Florence. She said, we are leaving Europe, but we're still Europeans. And she said it here in Florence, because we are European. I have seen this reaction in the electoral results in 2017, especially with the victory of President Macron in France. And we've all seen it in a moment of, at last, an economic growth, which is important, not just because we've achieved important figures. I mean, when the growth is 2.4, well, it is an important growth for a mature area. And also the gap between those who are more advanced and those who are less advanced is the smallest that we've had in Europe in the last 20 years. Since when money was devalued competitively, when these were the difficulties. Finally, in the Eurozone, the gaps have been bridged somehow thanks to the growth with a common dynamics. So, we have experienced the season of hope after the season of dire crisis for the Union. Now, I think that we're going through a moment that is a moment of uncertainty, to speak honestly. I believe that what's the state of the Union? Well, I would say uncertain. The most difficult crisis is behind us, but the season of hope, the Declaration of Rome, Macron's speech at the Sorbonne, the speech by Jean-Claude Juncker on the State of the Union, precisely at the European Parliament. It's hard to translate these ambitions into a concrete progress. I mean, I wouldn't want Federica Mogherini to scold me, to tell me off because I'm being too pessimistic. But with that roadmap, that visionary roadmap that was present in some of these speeches, we have to be honest. Well, it's hard to bring all that about, and we have appointments awaiting us, and one that might reveal to be important, that is the European Council that will take place at the end of June, in just over a month. The Council of Europe, whose agenda, and I'm saying it also talking to my own country, to Italy, the current government won't represent Italy then. We're working on it. The Italian government will have to face this challenge. And there will be the challenge of completing the bank union and the economic challenge. Of course, we have to complete the bank union. Of course, we need to have mechanisms to stabilize this. But we haven't abandoned yet the debate that has paralyzed the Union in the past few years on these topics. It's as if the target were moved further and further ahead of a few meters or a few kilometers. You know that all of this debate, to simplify it, developed in the past few years on the theme of the difficult balance between sharing and reduction of the financial risk. But the season of sharing seems to be never coming, and the season of risk seems to be among us all the time. It's as if in the agenda of the European Union there were inevitably always the problem of reducing the financial risk. And with this context, with this framework, it's hard for us to tackle the challenges awaiting us. The countries that made reforms also dealing with huge internal difficulties are always asked to make further sacrifices, again, to further reduce the risk. And, of course, this corresponds to legitimate interests of other countries. Of course, I can see that. But in the end, we seem not to be able to abandon this vicious circle, and it's impossible to face the obvious needs that we have of protecting the employment and the welfare state in our countries, because the re-emergence of a crisis of trust towards the European project, we can't say that for the next 10 years it won't happen again. It's just there waiting us round the corner, and the way to respond to this risk is, once you are in a phase of growth, when distances are being bridged, well, the idea is to show that the common project of union produces protection, safety, investments, jobs, development, and not just balances of the budget. I understand it's an endless discussion and an endless debate. It's going to be hard to complete the bank union with the stabilization mechanisms that should have this name. I won't be at the end of June meeting, but I can sign these words that I've just said. But we won't be able to go on if the logic is always, okay, let's postpone by another 6 months, by another year, the dynamics of risk sharing, because there's always a ghost. And I mean, I understand the political reasons and the historical reasons behind us. And on the theme of migration, Jean-Claude repeated it over and over again, and I would like to thank him today as well, because every time I listen to him, I am proud of the work that we've done. Italy saved the honor of Europe. So the President Juncker often repeated that. And I would like to add that especially in the past year, 18 months, we've done it. Italy has done it, demonstrating something that seemed almost impossible. That is, the fact that it is possible to reduce the extent, hence the danger and the destabilizing effect at the social level of the migration flows. We reduced them. If we consider the period between the 1st of January and the 9th of May of this year, we reduced them by 83% in these 4.5 months. And it can be done in parallel, opening slightly the door to safe migration flows for the participants, so to say, and for the hosting countries that totally change the migration equation in our continent. We Italians demonstrated that it is possible to do it. We could make it. And we almost did it by ourselves with the support of the Commission and of some individual countries who were willing to help us in the Union. Were I to say that the European Union intervened all of it, well, this is not the case. This is not what happened. The operation was performed by Italy, and it should continue. Message in a bottle. Okay, let's end it here.
L'altro tema.
The other theme that we will discuss about, and it's important for Italy to have clear ideas about it, is the so-called multi-year financial framework, basically the budget for Europe in the 2022-2026 period. I don't think Jean-Claude is still here, so he won't get offended if I say that I am not that confident that we'll be able to do it. Of course, I appreciate his activity. I don't think we'll be able to do it before the next European elections. I'm also saying it in relation to some titles that I've seen on the Italian newspapers, that we've been deprived of 6 billions. Yeah, that, I don't know, it could be. But if that's going to happen, it might happen in 2021. So this debate will continue. And it's a complicated debate because 27 different countries have got to agree. They all have a veto, right? We have to do it with less resources because one of the few net contributor countries, the United Kingdom, is no longer there, and Italy, which is another net contributor, will have to face more expenses. Italy, like France and Germany. So we are countries who give more than they receive. So it's a complicated mixture. Nonetheless, I believe that, of course, on the agricultural policy and the cohesion policy, we can't accept to cancel the things that exist. I believe that the bases that have been prepared by the Commission are positive bases. There are some strong ideas. The common commitment on immigration, on innovation, these are battles that Italy has fought over the past few years. Why not acknowledge to the Commission that their proposal is a positive, advanced proposal? There are risks. Well, we'll fight the risks. Also because the discussion will continue, the debate will continue. And every country has its own right to make its own reasons heard. Of course, a compromise will have to be reached. So, I was saying, phase of uncertainty after the phase of crisis and of lack of trust. So, the phase of uncertainty is developing while around us. The request for Europe has never been stronger. It's deafening for those who want to hear it. And it is a strategic request coming from the future of the world, from geopolitics, from our role in the world. And the issues that are at the center of the European debate have got to do with our future, the features of trade, custom taxes, custom duties. We expect a permanent exemption from our American friends. So we expect that the European countries will be exempted from the duties levied by the American administration. And also we have to work to find compromises, agreements also with the States, with the United States, Iran. Mrs. Mogherini has talked about it. Can we trace our steps back? Can we withdraw from that deal? I mean, we're talking about this issue for its commercial impacts and its financial impacts. Of course, they're there. But very easily we can, because if we really think about it, that deal wasn't an agreement on Hezbollah in Lebanon or on Shiites in Iraq or on the war in Yemen. That was a deal to avoid having nuclear weapons in an important country in the region, and the country is Iran. That was a deal. A commitment, a serious, measurable commitment to renounce to nuclear weapons in exchange for the dropping of the sanctions. Is there someone out there who can say that that deal was violated? Was there a breach? And I'm not talking about 10 years ago. I'm talking recently, when it was after it was signed. There are independent bodies that have to verify it. If they declared it, of course, a problem would emerge. The issue is not underestimate the aggressiveness, the threat, and the other dangers that exist in the region. These are all topics on which the Italian diplomacy, the European diplomacy, can and must be active on. But if we mix these two things, if we think that by allowing or forcing Iran to build nuclear weapons, we solve the problem of Hezbollah or of the Yemen war, well, I think we have a simplistic setup. But this is a big challenge for the European Union. With which instruments can we tackle such a challenge? We could say something also about the climate, how important it is that Europe has a firm stand. We remain on the ideas, but on the financial aspects, so and so, for the agreement reached in Paris. But the request for union goes beyond the common market and its advantages. Even in today's world, we could say that it's the European Union's task to defend some fundamental values that we have experienced in the past 70 years. So it's the European Union's, first of all, to practice them, to implement them in all its 27/28 countries. And it's the task of the European Union to defend them. Multilateralism, free trade, dialogue, open society. The request for Europe from this point of view is so strong that if we withdraw, if we hold back, I think we lose a historic occasion, and the risk is to go back. And we can't surrender to the idea that those values, multilateralism, open society, free trade, dialogue, we can't say they are all tools to be put up and left in the attic, because this is what one can perceive around the world. Well, yes, there were the 90s, great, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but, well, now there are strength relationships, the military, economic interests, and of these founding values of the Western world, we could say, I'm not saying we could do without them, but Europe is more and more and will increasingly be asked to be the banner of these values. We need this tranquil, calm superpower, and we need it today because the sovereign answers, as Mr. Mattarella mentioned yesterday during this event, answers based on sovereignism are not wrong, they're just an illusion. This is why we need Europe, even though we know, unfortunately, that the contagious effect of these illusions has continued. It's not just Brexit, it's not just Visegrad, it's also the Italian electoral result. And of course, this is certainly one of the factors that should keep us awake. We all know that were this set up to involve one of the founding countries of the Union would be very serious. One of the three big countries, founding members of the Union. It would be a novelty with a serious impact within the European context. During the last electoral campaign in Europe, in Italy, here in Italy, I've heard some speeches based on illusions and dangerous at the same time. I believe, again, that it is important here today in Florence to remind everyone of the risks that our country would have, for us Italians, but for Europe, of course, as well, if Italy chose to take a different road, not to give continuity to the growth and to this reduction of the debt, to appear once again after a strong treatment of recovery, to appear once again fragile on the market. If that migration policy that is was balanced, that led to the results that I mentioned earlier on. If Italy gave up and renounced the effort, which I try to do personally, to present the action of the government as an action aimed at promoting cohesion and not divisions, to bridge social wounds, not opening up new tears. I am convinced, all in all, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, that the largest majority of Italians doesn't really want to abandon this path from one of the founding pillars of our country, i.e. the European commitment, which has allowed us to have 60 years of peace and prosperity. I'm confident that the navigation of the new government will continue along this route, because this is what Italy was and what Italy is. Those who would like to bring Italy elsewhere, well, they would have to come to terms not with political battles, but with our history, our identity. This is Italy. This is Italy how and the way it's been for the last 60 years. In a way, it is almost a forced direction, the one I'm talking about. Luckily for Italy, we're in Europe, and luckily for Europe, Italy is there. With its strength, with its consistency, with its own independence for foreign policy, we are and we will remain proudly Italians and Europeans. Thank you.
With this, we conclude the 2018 State of the Union Conference. Thank you very much for your attention and participation, and we hope to see you next year.